Let's move on. US President Donald Trump says he will demand the death penalty for murder be introduced to Washington, D.C., having already deployed the National Guard in the US Capitol. Trump is now tackling what he says is a city overrun by violent gangs. But critics and city authorities in Washington say the president is attempting to assert his power over Washington, a city that in 3 presidential elections has voted at least 90% for his Democratic rivals. Well, in the US, we have Kethevane Gorjestani now to tell us more about the situation in Washington. So we have this announcement of the death penalty. Tell us how significant that is and whether Trump can actually introduce it.
Well, to understand what is happening there, you have to see the system in the United States. In D.C., just like in the rest of the U.S., there are local courts and federal courts. But because D.C. has a particular status, the D.C. local courts basically are bound by a city code in which there is a ban on bringing in the death penalty. However, because of that specific status, the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., so the government, can prosecute both in the federal courts and in the local court. What does that mean? That means that legally and technically, it is true that Donald Trump and his administration have the authority to bring cases in front of a local court and ask for the death penalty in those cases. And they've already indicated that they're going to be doing so in several cases, including the case of that man who killed a couple who worked at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. That is the legal side, but practically it will be very hard to implement that push in Washington, D.C. The last time a death penalty case was tried was back in 2003, but it will be very hard in the Democratic liberal bubble that is Washington, D.C. to find 12 jurors to unanimously agree to impose a death sentence. That's what happened back in 2003. 2 men were tried under the death penalty, but the jury never agreed to put out that death penalty. So with many things with Donald Trump, this is more about the announcement rather than the actual changes or concrete moves that it's going to be making on the ground. And it's part of Donald Trump's effort to take control of Washington, D.C., and to show that he is tough on crime, that he's the president of law and order.
Well, as you were just saying there, he's had this push on law and order. It's clear in his attempt to send troops to various cities around the U.S., but his authority there is less clear, isn't it?
Yes, Donald Trump has already deployed the National Guard both in Los Angeles and in Washington, D.C. He's threatening to do it in other cities, including in Chicago. No surprise there. All the cities that he's being targeting are Democrat-led cities. Again, there's a difference between D.C. and the rest of the states. In D.C., the president of the United States acts basically as the governor of Washington, D.C. Therefore, he does have the authority to deploy those National Guard troops in the capital. But in other cities, like in Los Angeles, technically the president doesn't actually deploy the National Guard. It has to be done in conjunction with the governor, and definitely not done in opposition to the governor's will, which is what happened in Los Angeles. There are several very specific exceptions, and that's what Donald Trump did in Los Angeles. He invoked an obscure statute that gives him the authority in cases of rebellion, for example, against the government of the United States. And he argued that the protests against the immigration crackdown in Los Angeles amounted to a rebellion against the governor of the United States. There's a legal fight now to determine whether or not he overstepped his authority in this case. And the same thing could happen if he decides to go into Chicago over the head of the Democratic governor there. In this case, the Trump administration is arguing that crime is so rampant in Chicago that it warrants taking over the National Guard and taking control of that city. Again, here, as in Washington, D.C., it's about asserting his power over Democratic-led cities that he claims are violent, chaotic, out of control, and also pushing the limits of where his authority as a president of the United States stands.
Well, that presidential authority, the limits of that authority has been tested. It's gone beyond troops. How have U.S. institutions been reacting to that?
Well, the latest example of that push is clearly what we've talked about, which is that Federal Reserve governor that Donald Trump announced he was firing, Lisa Cook. Now, technically, again, if you look at the letter of the law, the president, in certain specific instances, when he has cause, he's allowed to fire the governor of the Federal Reserve. But that has never been done by any president in the 111-year history of the Federal Reserve in the United States. Lisa Cook has announced that she's going to fight this because she believes there is no cause. But what you see here in this example, whether it's with the National Guard, with immigration, with the tariff war, is that Donald Trump is trying to either find a loophole or invoke emergency powers to claim authority to do something, even though the details of that are very blurry. He has paired that with also an all-out assault on any counterweight to presidential authority, the usual counterweights, the judges in the courts, the representatives or the senators in Congress, law firms, universities, even the media. And it's not something new in the United States. Nearly every president, whether Democratic or Republican, in very specific cases, have tried to push the bounds of presidential authorities. But the volume and the breadth of Trump's efforts make it really unprecedented. Trump has said it many times very publicly that he believes that the president basically can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and that no one should be able to actually tell him no. He doesn't believe governors can say no. He doesn't believe Congress can say no. He doesn't believe courts can say no, and he doesn't believe, it seems, that the Constitution can block him from doing what he wants. The Constitution specifically laying out the sort of checks and balances in the U.S. political system to prevent just that, to prevent the concentration of too much power in one branch of government, in this case, too much power in the executive branch.
Kethevane, thank you so much for that piece of analysis. Kethevane Gorjestani there.